I was asked by Cătălin to talk about my special interest in collective housing estates, in apartment buildings that are part of ensembles, that are part of we call them ensembles, like in French, and this goes like a wordplay for the title of my presentation for today, because it means both having these buildings together, but also living together in these ensembles. I grew up in a not so good building that was in an ensemble, which did not follow the functionalist ideas and ideals. The group of buildings lacked urban design. It was, although not very nice, it was a place that represented an efficient answer to the need for dwellings in communist Romania, with strong top-down policies addressing housing as a right of the inhabitants. But there were no green spaces, no playgrounds, no parking places. Anyway, there were not so many cars either, so that was not a big problem. Then I became a student in architecture, and as you can see, the presentation follows a structure that is given by a sort of a timeline. And when I went to study architecture, I had a very different living experience that helped me to contrast, to compare my experience when I grew up. So I lived in the center of Bucharest, in an old neighborhood, in a villa. So it was a lot of space, and the height of the rooms was bigger, and the number of square meters was higher, and so on and so forth. So this brought me to many questions about the quality of the living places. And during my studies, I paid attention to lectures on the principles on creating a new neighborhood. I was interested in learning about the history of architecture in terms of references for building a neighborhood from the scratch, and building neighborhoods in which many people can live together. The same questions that were important then are still important to me today. And I am currently teaching and working on conditions for a good neighborhood still. So in Bucharest today, the options for living are not so many. So we have the huge majority of dwellings in buildings of the communist regime ensembles. That is our focus for today. But we also have small plots with houses from the 50s, the 60s, or from before that. Of course, these houses are replaced by individual initiative today. Real estate developers had their initiatives in the suburbs, so we find many new estates, but with rather small plots and lacking sidewalks, and of course it's urban sprawl, so with all the bad things that come with it. And we also have new collective housing buildings, but sometimes they have higher densities than the ensembles built during the communist regime, and they are built on pieces of land that were previously used as industrial for industry. And yes, they don't offer much in terms of facilities for education, for health, for public spaces. Yes, they offer parking places. Sometimes you have to pay some extra money for getting a parking place. But all in all, it's not like a very high quality of housing option. We also have here in the middle a picture that represents an option that is quite limited, though, both in terms of cost and availability, and that would be the Art Deco small apartment buildings, rather small apartment buildings. And on the map of the city, you can see in yellow the collective housing that represents 80% of the dwellings. Here I have tried to present it at the same scale. And we have like a reference, the red dot, which represents here the House of the Parliament, which is the biggest building in the world after the Pentagon, from what we read. And that's why I consider it a good reference point, a good reference red dot for orienting the viewers. So here we have the protected areas, and in these protected areas we will find many of the Art Deco buildings I mentioned earlier. But I also want to say that these collective housing ensembles are not outside the city. So we do not have like in Western cities a peripheric or these collective housing ensembles are part of the city. I wanted to emphasize on that. Also in terms of how the inhabitants of these buildings, of these ensembles, consider themselves. And in terms of facilities that the city offers, public transportation, commercial facilities, and so on and so forth. Another map is showing both the map of Bucharest, but also a scheme that represents different categories of buildings by decade, by 10 years. In a way, this is taken from a book that was published in 1982. So we have here what was considered as cheap buildings from before the Second World War in dark gray. The residential areas from before the World War, the neighborhoods, the old neighborhoods. But in with this, we have functionalist ensembles, kvartals, big ensembles. So there is this, if you want, sub-definition of the yellow areas that we have seen previously. So what we have here in one color, here, even in the 82, the author of the book called Urban Housing was explaining differences between different sorts of ensembles. And we will do here like a fast forward history lesson, because I want the audience to understand that we call them all collective housing. We all know that they were built before the change of the regime, but there are many differences between the approaches and the results. Again, by decade, we could say that in the 50s, the way of building housing for the workers was emphasizing on presenting a prestigious facade and doing some urban design following axes of composition. And also the street had had its importance, and the urban composition was following somehow the street design, the design of the pathways. When after in the 60s and 70s, the ideals of the functionalist city were more present, and as you can see here, the composition takes into account the presenting the facade with not so many windows towards the north, so the heliomatic conditioning for a good building. And we have also big green areas and commercial facilities with cinemas and other uses. All this changed the year I was born, in 74. There was this legislation that was passed by the Communist Party that imposed a more intensive use of land. And the ideas of functionalist urban composition with volumes that are in greenery and all that changed for more efficient use, which meant, if you can see here, this is a boulevard, and even though behind you still have the plots with the houses, with the individual houses, for presenting like the victory of socialism and modernization of the society and efficiency and new housing that was offered to the population, you have these canyons that are imposed. So many demolitions had to occur in order to make place for these buildings, and voluntary work was imposed. And here we have some images in which from each of these buildings people had to go out, and even though they didn't want to, there was a lot of pressure for them to show contribution to the management of public spaces in their neighborhoods. The atmosphere of the time, the ambiance, the feeling. So on one hand, we had the demolitions that were made in order to make room for those buildings, but also for the big house of the parliament that we have seen. And of course, me as a child, I didn't know about all this. And what we had was, these are not pictures of me, but it's an entire generation that has common references about spending time in between the blocks without having specially designed playgrounds. The street was the playing ground. There were no many cars, as I said, so you could ride a bike on the street. There were many games that we have played outside while our parents were with their jobs. So it was like a common reference that a kid would have the key of the apartment around the neck in order not to lose it. You know, the same feeling of building from the scratch for these ensembles, we find it nowadays in the suburbs, again building from the scratch. But what I could say, and this will be a focus for my presentation today, is the relationship between public policies and urban design. It was from the scratch, but there were some principles of urban design in the 70s more than in the 80s, as I said. While nowadays, many of these new dwellings are built on plot-to-plot basis, without much consideration for public interest, public facilities, public spaces. Now, what happened to these buildings during the 90s? So we had in 89 a revolution, and the communist regime fell, and then it was a popular measure, somehow encouraged by international consultants, that public housing stock should be sold to the tenants. But even before the 90s, we had like half of the population living in these apartments were owners, and something like 1/3 of their income went to the state to pay for the apartment. And with the money that the state was gathering from the ones who wanted to buy, the new buildings were built with higher and higher speed and with lower and lower quality. From the 70s towards the 80s, we can see that the industry was producing a lot of prefabricated panels. The speed of producing units and declaring them for the reports to the Communist Party was, as I said, higher and higher, and the workers on these buildings were less and less prepared and professionalized. That brought us to the situation in which, in the beginning of the 90s, the tenants could buy these apartments for very low prices, and they were not aware that becoming owners also means that they have responsibilities for these buildings. The privatization was made in a strange way in terms of land surrounding these buildings. So you do not have, so in green here would have like the imprint of the building on the soil, but then in the co-ownership you would have only 1 meter around the building as the condominium land, the land of the building that is shared property, and the rest of the space around is the ownership of the local council, which means that the local council could pass decisions to sell or to rent land, or even to give it as in the retrocession process that followed, because we had many people who claimed in the 50s there was nationalization of land and buildings and apartments, and after the change of the regime, actually only since 2000, the former owners could claim back their property. And in some cases, since their property could not be given back, could not be retrocessed, then the local council could decide to give a piece of land in between these apartment buildings in the neighborhood. Okay, so from 67 private ownership on dwellings in 1990, rural and urban together, we get in Bucharest to almost 100% in the housing ensembles, privately owned. Okay. This is important because the management of these buildings is now in the hands of the housing associations. They were imposed to be created from 1994, and the skills for the management of these buildings were not so good in the beginning, but little by little you have professionalizing services for management of condominiums, as they are called now. And the municipality is helping for thermic rehabilitation and thermic insulation, and of course, because the land around them is in the ownership and in the administration of the local council, we have interventions for introducing playgrounds, for reducing green spaces, for offering more parking places, which is a huge problem today in these ensembles that were not designed for the big number of cars that are needed today, the number of parking places. Yes, now back to me. As a young student, as I said, I was very curious about what makes a good place for living. After graduating architecture studies, I was part of the first edition of a master program that was done in cooperation with a French university from Lyon. And in this region of France, Rhône-Alpes, they have an interesting experience with copropriétés fragiles, with condominiums that are in which not so rich people live, and they are basically trapped there. Even though they are owners, they do not afford the costs for repairing their buildings, and the decision making in co-ownership in condominium is always difficult, and it's even more difficult when the residents have various levels of income, and some can afford to invest and some others, the majority actually, cannot. And based on that, I learned about these things during the master program, and then I applied for a PhD scholarship. So I had the chance to have several internships in Institut d'Urbanisme de Lyon, and there I have studied the various case studies of intervention in condominiums, with that reading, I dared to partnership with another NGO. In the presentation that was in the beginning, ATU, Association for Urban Transition, was mentioned. It's an NGO that has been established in 2001 when we graduated the first edition, the first promotion of the master program called Integrated Urban Development. And because we had this experience on these ideas on how urban management and operational urban regeneration initiatives can be organized, we wanted to do the same in Romania. So in the beginning of the years 2000, we have succeeded in getting financial support from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to work together with Ville en Transition, an NGO in Lyon. And what we did was to try to promote an approach that starts with a diagnosis, and then you have participatory planning together with the community of the ensemble. And of course, in France, all that is initiated and carried on by the municipalities. In Romania, it was a bottom-up initiative that started as an action research experience. A few words about Association for Urban Transition. The transition in the title came from the economic economical transition of the 90s and the years 2000. Now transition suits us very well because it's ecological transition, and we thought that it's always a transition in our cities. And we have several pillars for this organization. It's research-oriented, applied research, action research, but we also care very much about dialogue and transparency in decision-making and the importance of discussing before acting and having various perspectives on an issue. And also it's about getting the profession of urban planner to be more recognized and more appreciated, why not, in our country. Working in this field means not only for architects, but also to encourage economists and people with background in juridical studies or public administration studies or communication studies or different backgrounds to work together in interdisciplinary teams for urban transformation. So our timeline, my timeline, and the structure of the presentation goes now to the years 2005, when together with Ville en Transition, as I said, and with some help from somebody from the municipality of Sector 1 in Bucharest, we have selected, we haven't been called there, but we were accepted by the local community of this building that was part of a small ensemble that is placed at the entrance in Bucharest from the airport. That would be the main road that takes us from the airport into the city. And here we have units that are with very limited surface, 1 bedroom, the living room, and a very small kitchen and a very small bathroom. Basically, this is the structure of the apartment here. And we also have a community in which more than 1/3 lived for more than 30 years. So basically, since the creation of this ensemble. Now these people were the ones who had more time to discuss with us because they are pensioners, and they also had positions in the association of owners, president and member of the committee, and from this survey, even though they were neighbors for such a long time, because their situation changed and the situation of their children, and some have made it and some were still not very sure about their future, we could sense a certain degree of envy and suspicion between neighbors. So even though they have common interest with this building, it was very difficult to bring them together and to discuss about the future of the building and to talk about the resources that can be raised in order to improve the conditions in this building. And as we have seen in France, we did this analysis on various indicators, and with these analyses, we had the power to envision a possible future in terms of public space, but also in terms of building refurbishment And we had long discussions with the inhabitants about who should pay for what, and a certain degree of inertia was present in the sense that they were and many still are waiting for somebody to solve their problems to come. And we did these presentations and talks, and it was very hard to even discuss about the options there. To put a hierarchy in the needs for improvement of the building. And as I said, people who had the time are people who know the place very well because they have been living there for so long. And as always, as I said, we were trying to make connections between public policies. At the time, it was this idea of helping for the thermic insulation with 2/3 of the costs, and the homeowners association was supposed to give the other third of the costs. Meanwhile, because of the fact that we have rich local councils in Bucharest, they can afford to pay for the entire amount in order to do thermic insulation. That is basically what happened to this building 5 years after we were there. They have got a subvention for thermic insulation for the entire building. So for the inhabitants, that was for free. But much more could have been done, and not only for the improvement of the building itself. Of course, it's a big need for that. But what about the public spaces, or as Catalin calls them, the semi-public spaces? Because even though they are in the ownership of the local council, they are appropriated by the inhabitants. And we can see in this picture that somebody has opened the door directly from outside. So this family does not get into the staircase any longer. They can get in the apartment directly from outside. And my concern at the time, and I'm still on these issues, that what is the role of the special planners, of the expertise in dealing with the space? If we know how to improve the place, how can we get to have the money paid for this improvement and the decision to be made? So we still have a lot to convince the professionals to recognize the legitimacy of the local councillors or mayors in the decision-making processes. We still have very few professionals that are looking for the citizens' participation and as the French call it, expertise d'utilisateur, the know-how of the users. Before getting to propose any urban design for any improvement, how about knowing very well the needs and the expectations of the users of that place? And of course, we have a lot of new developments in which the professionals had to follow the business plan more than the principles of good urban design. So we are somehow in the middle. We have to deal with all the urban actors here, and urban design preparing the projects. It's a process in which more negotiation and more dialogue should happen. Now, we move in time 5 more years, and we are now recognized as part of a group that answered the tender launched by the Ministry of Development, Public Works and Housing for designing a methodology for the improvement of the quality and the functionality of the public spaces in the large housing ensembles. And after reading a lot and looking around for examples around the world, we basically took the urban design procedure, the urban documentation that is called the zonal urban plan, and we have adapted the stages of this procedure in order to answer to the specific needs of the large housing ensembles. Of course, there are several stages. You have to set first the objectives, and here, of course, we talked a lot about the fact that these ensembles are already inhabited, and they have been inhabited for a while now. So you have in them many people who can speak a lot to the designers about their needs and about their aspirations. And in order to set good objectives for an intervention, it's very useful to have participatory planning very early in the process. And of course, that was the advice that we wrote down in this methodology. Then about the analysis, what you should look into more detail in relationship to the specificity of the public space or semi-public space in the large housing ensembles. And we have used recent tools that were developed here. Was an example of analysis that was done with tools developed by Space Syntax. And JR represented an advisory consultancy company on economy and public administration. So we had urban design, we had public administration, and we had a good knowledge of procedures in terms of urban planning in Romania and procedures that would bring together different stakeholders around the table. And to move on faster, because there is no much time left, I will not discuss into detail about the ways in which you get to set the projects that are to be implemented in a place. What I can say here with sadness is that this approach, although required by the ministry, is in the drawers somewhere of the ministry, and it's a pity because local public administration have a lot of responsibilities in order to improve large housing ensembles, but they don't have enough interest or know-how, and very often instead of using urban design, they pay a lot of money to buy expensive playgrounds or to intervene for the reshaping of the public space in order to give more space to the cars, and without considering the special characteristics of that particular space and of those particular users. Now, in my timeline, of course, I was very disappointed because when we worked on that methodology, there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of how to say that. I felt so empowered that all the things that I have learned during my PhD research grant and traveling in other places, and the input that came from a spin-off that was based in UK. So the space syntax methods and all those discussions and all those presentations went to nothing. So the result was not to be seen. So fortunately, I have several hats. So when my hat as a consultant does not give much in return, I put the hat of the researcher, and here we have an article that was published together with Liviu Chelcea about these housing estates in a publication in which we have tried to present the housing ensembles in Bucharest, at least, as places where people will continue to buy and sell apartments and will continue to live. And so it's not like in other cities in which they have this image of poor neighborhoods, of segregated communities. Not at all. These housing ensembles are part of the city. Of course, there is one exception, but in general, as I started by saying, inhabitants of large housing estates in Bucharest, they live together. They have, if they have the choice, they would go for an apartment that would be close to their relatives and friends from childhood. So they are still functional. This would be they are still viable housing solution. And more recently, together with Catalin and another colleague, Zina Macri, we have an article that was accepted in the Journal of Housing and Built Environment. This will be published, I think, in autumn. And now the last slide in my timeline. I teach about the future of these housing ensembles in the idea that some of my students will work on improving them. And yes, so I left a bit of time in order to be asked some questions. I'll be very happy to discuss some of these things. How is the condition of the large housing ensembles in your countries, or what was curious about what I have shown here? Yes. Well, social housing. Okay, so do we call these ensembles social housing? I guess no, because now they are private ownership. Yes, but in these apartments we find middle class with low income, and they are owners. So what they have to pay, and sometimes it's a struggle. It's the heating costs during the winter. So we will have some subventions for people with low income for the heating costs in winter. This is like help for the housing of people with low income. But that does not mean that these units are social housing. What else we have is we have long lists of people who have been evacuated from the villas and the Art Deco buildings that I mentioned earlier because of the retrocession process. And these people, we don't know where they go when they are asked to leave the apartments that were formerly social housing, because before being given back, they were in the administration of the municipality, and municipality was giving them as social housing to people with low income or no income at all. So even though they know that there is this number of people that will have no solution after they are sent away from these units, which are no longer social housing, we don't have initiatives of the municipality of Bucharest for building new units as social housing. Or if there is very, very little. We had some local council decisions to buy existing dwellings. Cătălin can answer this better than I can. In order to have some units to be given to some people on those lists, but the lists are much, much longer than the number of units that was bought from the market. So, and this is causing trouble, because you cannot think of the improvement of these buildings without the contribution of the owners. And if you do not consider helping on the basis of income for the refurbishment of these buildings, but what the municipalities did was to pay for the entire amount for everybody in one building that was isolated, thermic insulation, without looking into maybe some people in that building could pay for these costs. They could afford them very well. Some others couldn't, but it's pay the costs for everybody, and that's it. Yes. As a young person, I mean, the market is right now in Bucharest, the demand is quite high, and the fortunate young people who have a job in a company that pays well, they would go to a bank with high interest rate. They will get a loan, and they would start paying for 30 years for one apartment in these ensembles, or for a new unit in the highly dense buildings that are made nowadays. The young people who cannot afford to get a loan from the bank, they live with their parents. Some of these parents go back to the countryside in order to make room for the new families to live, you know, for their children who have children. So yes, it's not a city that that is friendly to low income or to young people. The access to housing is conditioned highly by revenue. I would say that the average income for young people would be around 1,000, but to pay a rent for a studio, it's at least one third of this income. So around 300 euros from 1,000 salary, something like that.
May I ask something?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Vera, for your presentation. My question regards the way you ended up doing urban planning, because you're an architect that totally embraced the career of an urban planner, And me, myself, I'm an architect who gave up architecture, which means design, to pursue sort of a career or a tentative career in social sciences. So I'm what I do now, I consider it to be more like anthropology. And of course, we've been doing things together, so we know very well one another. But I think it's worth a reflection on this sort of when you're dealing with housing, you can never stay within the limits of your own discipline, and then you have to work in larger teams and achieve new skills. So what made you think that urban planning is better than architecture in dealing this? Because you know very well we graduated the same school. It's a very art oriented bel art school, and we were taught that the architect is somebody who can make the total synthesis of the arts and the techniques and the politics and pretty much everything. So why not just architecture?
Okay, I said something in the beginning that I have been always fascinated about the connections between design and the policies or the conditions that are bringing you the brief for your design. So an architect, no matter how gifted or knowledgeable, still has to answer to a brief. So I'm very interested on how a brief is made out. Who has to say what? What public decisions can be made in order to put some objectives in the brief that would follow, you know, the needs and interests of the people who are already in that area. So this is the kind of discussion that was the core objective for establishing the association back in 2001, the Urban Transition Association. You can do many things with good design, but in order to get to have a designer to design, what happens before that? How a project starts and what kind of conditions are there for the design to answer to? I'm not sure if I answered your question. And I had at one point there was this optional course for students in architecture in Ion Mincu about housing policies. As a student, when I was in my third year, we had connections to housing policies in one theory of housing lecture, and I want to thank Ana Maria Zahariade for opening my eyes decades ago about the importance of pieces of legislation that define what is built and also for whom, and you know, as an architect, you need to be aware of these things. And not very many students in architecture realize the importance of the local council in their future career, or the importance of what kind of developer I will work for. What is that developer doing for the city, and what kind of win-win can be there? Not just the very big added value that my design could bring to a developer, but also the added value of that development that is to be shared with the rest of the city. Complicated stuff. And in order to attract students in my optional class on housing policies, we started by talking about criteria for housing, for good housing, good places to live in. And we've seen that there are many references and many of these references go to norms and regulations. And you see from this, and also the procedures through which an initiative gets its shape. What kind of approvals? What kinds of norms are checked and followed? Yeah, things like that. Even though you do not know the future users. Okay, so one thing is that about these collective housing ensembles, they exist, they have their inhabitants, the inhabitants are owners, so no matter what happened to these buildings in the future, you have to take into consideration their owners, yes, for their improvement. That's one thing. But then when we talk about new buildings and buildings that are developed by either by a private developer that does this for profit, or by publicly owned company in order to offer social housing or private-public partnership in order to offer a mix of things, then you do not know the users. Okay, but you have more and more references about sustainable design and about you have not only the norms, but you also have more and more recommendations and sets of criteria in order to evaluate the quality of that design. And even though you do not know the exact future users, you can still organize workshops or competitions, or in order to see the proposal, the design matches very well the context in which this will be built, and also the local culture, or even though you do not know the exact inhabitants of those units, but you might meet, if you want, the neighbors of that in that area, right? And there is another idea that is very rare in the public agenda, in the discussions. It's about the architect who knows the users because they are organized as a collective. When we talk about cooperative housing, then the architect can be a facilitator in order to build together with the housing cooperative a brief that represents both the future users, the future co-owners in that cooperative, and the interest of the city for the development of that area. There are very interesting cases, not in Romania, unfortunately, but in Austria, in Germany, in Switzerland, and I guess that this would be a situation in which you have the rare occasion to talk to the users, who are many and who are also the co-authors of the brief.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Vera. Yes, yes, as I know, in Indonesia, I'm from Indonesia, actually, that sometimes the urban design can what is it? Recommendation for public policy when the government talk to the community or the civil society and do some discussion in FGD focus group discussion as well, and it takes time to get dealing with the what is best situation for the location, for the policies and other. Is there any time bound or limited time to the process, because we need to get to the best deadline for good public policy? In other way, the community needs to get certain or sure what can they cut from the policy or the urban design for community as well? Thank you.
Yes, in our organization, we read a lot, and we have been trying to practice participatory planning. And it is true that it takes time. But on one hand, the time that you spend in getting the community to know about the project and to express their expectations, it's time that you might get because that community will not oppose your initiative later on. So again, when we talk about public policies, local urban policies, we have decision makers, and they can recognize in this time that the community, the designers, that the decision makers spend together discussing about future transformations of the space. This is time for them. It's time for them, making them visible. So it's another, if you want, benefit from opening up the process towards the citizens. Yes, it is time consuming, but you have many bad experiences when this process is not well designed. So as you have design for urban design, you would also have to have design for the process. And from what I have seen lately, you have more and more, it's the case to have like specific know-how and specific training for some people who can facilitate the process. So the time is well managed, but also you have objectives for this process that are established from the very beginning. So what I would answer to that is, yes, it takes time. Sometimes this time that you spend in discussing before acting helps you to decrease the resistance and to have more visibility for your decisions and more votes at the end of the day. Why not? But also, when you do this process early, very early, as early as possible, and you design it with clear objectives and clear methods that are adapted to those objectives, that's, again, it's it takes a designer to think about this process with the objectives, with the methods, and what are the risks, who's expecting to get what from all those meetings. Yes, and this, again, in France, I could see, yeah, they can be either non-profits or small companies in which young professionals with different backgrounds work together as teams in order to help a municipality to organize processes like that. So they are paid by the municipalities, not big amounts of money, but it is for sure that a municipality might not have people who are specialized in communicating, in presenting what is an urban design competition, or what is an urban design procedure, or what an urban design regulatory framework, or whatever. So it takes people who are specialized in communication and in urban design to know what they talk about, to organize these processes to go smoothly. So this would be my answer. It's like a specialization. Yes. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Doctor.
Good, Vera, there is also a question from Zlata. Are new housing developments in Bucharest support a social mix or contribute to the social division of the inhabitants?
As I said earlier, there are new developments, of course there are, and there is demand for them. But you only get there if you have a good income and you can pay the money. So for the moment, there was no partnership between municipality and private developers to organize a place in which you will have a mix of social housing that is built together with privately owned housing that is bought on the market. So no, that it's as I said, I think that the level of the capacity of public administration to interfere with the housing is limited to this insulation that is paid entirely, no matter who is the owner of the apartment in that building that gets improved this way.
That means that is not supporting a social mix, the new housing developments.
No,